There is a kind of loneliness that money cannot touch. Not the loneliness of a cold night, or a quiet room. But the kind that lives inside a man who has everything the world said would make him whole, and still wakes up at 3 in the morning, reaching for something he cannot name. This is the story of Alexander Hale. A man who built a billion-dollar empire with his bare hands. A man who turned nothing into something extraordinary. A man whose name was spoken in boardrooms, in country clubs, in the whispered conversations of people who admired him from a distance. And yet, the one thing he could never build. The one thing no amount of intelligence, ambition, or money could manufacture. Was a child. And when the men he called friends discovered that secret, they did not offer compassion. They raised their glasses. And they laughed. But this story is not about the laughter. It is about a quiet woman named Miriam. A woman who arrived with no resume, no credentials, no explanation. A woman who carried something ancient in her hands. Something golden. Something that would change Alexander Hale's life. In a way he never saw coming. Stay with me. Because what you are about to hear is the kind of story that doesn't just move through you. It stays. Before we continue, to our new viewers joining today, subscribe and say hello in the comments. I enjoy recognizing and welcoming members of our growing family. Today's warm shout-out goes to Jocelyn from Florida, Linda from the United States, and Barbara from South Africa. Thank you for being part of our family. Subscribe now and comment below so I can welcome you too. Before this story ends, you will find yourself asking questions. Not just about Alexander Hale, but about yourself. What does a man do, when he has conquered the entire world, and still cannot conquer the one wound inside him that refuses to heal? What happens to a marriage, when two people who love each other are quietly drowning in a grief they never chose? And what do you do, when a woman you barely know, looks at you with eyes that seem to understand everything you have never said out loud, and places something in your hands that has no rational explanation? Do you open it? Or do you walk away? There is a reason this story has been told. There is a reason it found its way to you today. Some stories do not arrive by accident. And if you are watching this right now, perhaps this one was always meant for you. So let's go back to the beginning. Back to the man Alexander was before the loneliness found him. Back to when ambition was enough. Back to when the future still felt like possibility. Rather than an empty room. Alexander Hale did not grow up with money. He grew up with hunger. Not the hunger of poverty, though there were lean years, cold winters, and refrigerators that were emptier than they should have been. No. He grew up with a different kind of hunger. The kind that wakes you before the alarm. The kind that makes you study when everyone else is sleeping. The kind that looks at every closed door and sees a challenge rather than a rejection. His father was a factory worker. His mother cleaned office buildings on weekends to help make ends meet. They were good people, proud, quiet, hard-working people, who gave Alexander something far more valuable than money. They gave him belief. You can be anything, his mother used to tell him, pressing her palm flat against his chest. Anything you can imagine. But you have to want it more than you want comfort. He never forgot that. By his mid-20s, Alexander was working 80-hour weeks at a real estate development firm, not as a senior partner, not as a manager, but as the young man who arrived first and left last. The one who reorganized the filing systems no one had touched in years. The one who noticed, in the margins of a contract no one else had read carefully, a clause that saved the company $4 million. That was the moment his boss looked at him differently. And that was the beginning. By 30, he had his own small firm. By 35, it wasn't small anymore. By 40, Alexander Hale was the kind of name that appeared in financial publications and whispered conversations at fundraisers. A self-made man. A rare thing. A genuinely rare thing. And through all of it, there was Eleanor. Eleanor Voss had met Alexander at a charity auction when they were both 29. She was an art consultant, thoughtful, perceptive, quietly radiant in a room full of people performing loudness. She had laughed at something he said, genuinely laughed, not the polished social laugh he was used to, and in that single sound, something shifted for him. They married 3 years later. And for a long time, life was beautiful. They traveled. They built. They talked about the future the way young couples do, with easy confidence, as if everything they wanted was simply waiting patiently around the next corner. Children were part of that future. A family was part of that future. It was never a question of if. Only when. But the when kept not arriving. And slowly, quietly, like fog that rolls in while you're sleeping. The waiting became something heavier. The wanting became something they carried separately. And the future they had imagined so clearly, began to blur. The diagnosis came on a Tuesday afternoon in October. There is nothing special about a Tuesday in October. The leaves were turning outside the clinic window, ember and rust and deep gold, the kind of autumn that looks like a painting. The sky was that particular shade of blue that only appears before the cold truly sets in. Alexander would remember all of it. The color of the sky. The doctor's tie, burgundy, with a small repeating pattern he couldn't quite make out. The sound of Eleanor's breathing beside him. And the words. I'm sorry. The results are conclusive. You are infertile. 7 words. 7 words, and the entire architecture of the future he had built in his mind, developed a crack so deep and so silent that he didn't even hear it happen. He nodded. He asked clinical questions. He thanked the doctor. He held Eleanor's hand as they walked to the car, and he opened her door, and he drove home in near silence, and he said all the right things. Because that is what Alexander Hale did. He functioned. He was composed. He managed. But inside, in the place behind his eyes that no one ever saw, something had simply stopped. Eleanor cried that night. Long, shaking sobs that she tried to muffle against her pillow so he wouldn't hear. He heard. He held her. He told her they would be all right. He told her they still had each other. He told her what she needed to hear. And he believed it, in the way that people believe things they desperately need to be true. But somewhere, beneath the reassurance, beneath the composure, a question had taken root. What is a man without a legacy? They tried everything. Every specialist their money could reach. Every treatment that medicine offered. Every procedure that promised possibility. And with each one, came hope. And with each one, came its end. There is a particular kind of grief that comes from trying. From allowing yourself to believe, again and again, only to be shown, gently, clinically, without malice, that the answer is still no. That grief wears people down in ways that are hard to see from the outside. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand attention. It simply accumulates, layer by layer, like silt settling at the bottom of a river, until eventually the water that runs over it is running over a different riverbed entirely. Alexander poured himself into work. Eleanor poured herself into her art consultancy, into causes, into filling her calendar with beautiful things. They were kind to each other. They were respectful. They were, by all appearances, a picture of a successful marriage. But they had both, silently, separately, without ever quite saying it aloud, begun to grieve not just the child they hadn't had, but the version of themselves they had expected to become. The cruelty, when it came, did not arrive with fanfare. It never does. Alexander had known Richard Ashworth for over a decade. They had gone through the same circles, the same charity boards, the same investment groups, the same handful of exclusive restaurants where the tables are always available for the right last name. Richard was the kind of man who treated his own success as evidence of superior character. He had 3 sons. He spoke about them often. Loudly. With the particular pride of a man who believes that fatherhood is not merely a personal joy but a proof of something. It was at one of these dinners, 18 months after the diagnosis, that it happened. Richard had been drinking well. The conversation had moved, as it often did in these circles, from deal structures to legacies. Who would carry the names? Who would inherit the empires? Whose sons were showing promise? Richard raised his glass with that particular wide smile that men wear when they are about to say something they know is cutting but have convinced themselves is charming. To legacy, he said. To sons who carry our names forward. The glasses went up. The laughter went up. And then, the glance. It was brief. It was almost imperceptible. But Alexander saw it. The slide of Richard's eyes toward him. The slight upturn at the corner of his mouth. The way 2 or 3 others at the table followed that glance and had to look away to contain their amusement. And then another man, Marcus, who had always been Richard's echo, leaned back in his chair with a smile and said, quietly enough to seem offhand but loudly enough to be heard. Well, most of us, anyway. The laughter that followed was not thunderous. It was not a roar. It was the worst kind of laughter, the kind that is measured, calibrated, designed to land precisely. Alexander smiled. God help him, he smiled. He raised his own glass. He said something smooth and deflecting, something that got its own polite chuckle and moved the conversation along. And no one at that table ever knew what it cost him. He sat at the red light for longer than necessary. And the question came back. What is a man without a legacy? Only this time, it was louder. If this story is already sitting with you, if Alexander's silence feels familiar, or if you've ever smiled through something that was quietly breaking you, drop a comment that says, "I'm still watching." Let's see who's truly with us until the end. Eleanor was the first to name it. Not in a conversation. Not in a confrontation. Eleanor was never one for confrontation. She named it in the way she had always communicated the deepest things, quietly, precisely, with care. She named it in a letter. He found it on a Wednesday evening, after a day that had been unremarkable in every way, which somehow made it worse. He stood in the doorway of his study for a long moment before picking it up. Then he sat down. And he read. Alexander. If you are reading this, then I have finally found the courage to do what I have been trying to do for months, which is tell you the truth. Not because I don't love you. I do. I love you more than I have ever been able to say in ways you could hear. But I think somewhere along the way, we both started grieving not just the family we couldn't have, but each other. And I don't know when that happened. I don't know how to undo it. I only know that we are both disappearing inside this house, and I can't watch either of us vanish any further. I need a life that feels complete, not because I have given up on you. But because I think, right now, we both need to find ourselves again. Please don't look for a way to fix this. Some things don't need to be fixed. Some things just need to be felt. He folded the letter. He placed it back in the envelope. He set the envelope on the desk. And then he sat in that study for 4 hours, not moving, not calling anyone, not pouring a drink. Just sitting. With the truth of what his life had become. Men like Alexander Hale are not raised to fall apart. They are raised to solve. To strategize. To find the angle, the leverage, the path forward. But grief does not respond to strategy. And loneliness does not negotiate. He threw himself into work with a ferocity that alarmed even his closest associates. 18-hour days. Aggressive acquisitions. Meetings scheduled back-to-back with no gaps, because gaps were where the silence lived, and the silence was no longer his friend. His personal assistant, a capable young woman named Dana, started leaving water and food quietly outside his office door during long days, because she had noticed he often forgot to eat. She never commented on it. She was perceptive enough to understand that some things are helped most by not being named. But even work, that old faithful armor, began to feel hollow. Because for the first time in his adult life, Alexander Hale sat across from himself in the mirror at 6 a.m, looked at his own reflection, and asked a question he had never asked before. What am I actually building this for? He had no answer. And a man who has no answer to that question is a man in genuine trouble. The social world he moved in did not become kinder. If anything, once word of his separation from Eleanor filtered through the circles, quietly, politely, the way gossip always moves through expensive rooms, the dynamic shifted. Pity replaced mockery. Which, in some ways, was worse. There is a particular indignity in being pitied by people you once considered peers. It carries with it an implied hierarchy, a sense that they have something you do not, and that their compassion for you is, underneath its polished exterior, a form of self-congratulation. Richard Ashworth sent a card. A card. With handwritten condolences that were so precisely worded they felt almost choreographed. Alexander didn't respond. He didn't return several calls. He began, quietly and without announcing it, to withdraw from the circles that had defined his social world for 15 years. Not bitterly. Not dramatically. Just, selectively. Choosing silence over performance. Choosing his own company over company that required a mask. And in that withdrawal, something unexpected began to happen. He began to think more clearly than he had in years. He had lived in this house for 11 years. And in some ways, he had never really been in it. He had passed through it. He had slept in it. He had hosted events in it and used it as a backdrop and a base. But he had never been still inside it. Not like this. And in the stillness, something began to surface. A question he had buried for a very long time. What do I actually want? Not what looks right. Not what proves something. Not what fills the room at a dinner table. What do I want? He was still sitting with that question, weeks later, no closer to an answer, when she arrived. Her name was Miriam. He had not hired her himself. That had been left to his household manager, who had been trying for months to bring some structure back to a house that was slowly losing its sense of being lived in. The posting had been placed quietly, a private household position, general domestic management, flexibility required. Miriam had responded with a letter rather than a resume. Not by design, apparently. Simply because that was how she expressed herself. The letter was brief. It said she had worked in private households for many years, that she was experienced with managing complex domestic environments, and that she believed a home should feel like a home, not a showpiece. That last line had caught his manager's attention. A home should feel like a home. In a world of polished CVs and carefully rehearsed interviews, that sentence was unusual enough to be interesting. When Miriam arrived, Alexander barely registered her presence. He was deep in a call that had run 30 minutes over. By the time he surfaced, she had already been shown around and had quietly begun restoring order to the kitchen, which had accumulated 3 weeks of the particular disorder that descends when someone is cooking for themselves without any sense of occasion. He passed her in the hallway later that afternoon. "You must be Miriam," he said. "Yes," she replied. That was the entirety of their first conversation. And yet, there was something about her presence. He couldn't name it. He was not a man who dealt comfortably in things he couldn't name. But over the days that followed, he became aware of it, a quality that the house took on when she was in it. A quietness that was different from emptiness. A sense of things being tended to, not just maintained. The curtains were opened each morning, something he had stopped doing. Meals appeared at reasonable hours, not elaborate meals, but good ones. Warm. Considered. The study, which he had stopped even trying to organize, had been tidied in a way that felt respectful rather than intrusive, his papers in the same general positions, but no longer scattered, no longer chaotic. She didn't ask permission for these things. She simply did them. As if she understood that sometimes, when a person is drowning in silence, what they need most is not to be rescued, but to be quietly, gently, steadily reminded that the world can still have order in it. They began to talk. Not at first. Not for weeks. But gradually, in the way that conversations develop in houses where two people spend time in proximity, brief exchanges over morning coffee, questions about the day's plans, small observations about the garden or the weather. He learned that she had grown up in the South. That she had raised 3 children of her own, now grown. That she had been widowed 12 years ago and had found, in the work of tending to other people's homes, something that gave her days shape and purpose. She never said these things as if they were important. She offered them the way people offer bread, simply, without ceremony, because it seemed like the right thing to share. And he, this man who had not truly talked to anyone in months, found himself talking back. Not about deals. Not about strategy. About real things. His father. The cold apartment. The night he had first understood that wanting something badly enough was not the same as deserving it, and that he would have to earn it. She listened in a way that people rarely listen. Without preparing her response. Without steering the conversation toward herself. Just, present. Absorbing. Weeks passed. And Alexander Hale, for the first time in years, began to feel something loosen inside him. Not joy. Not yet. But something adjacent to it. Something like, the possibility of joy. Which, if you have been without it long enough, feels almost as precious. It was the kind of night that had become too familiar. An evening that cost a great deal and gave very little. Conversations that circled the same surfaces. Men performing success at each other across tables that cost more per head than most people's monthly expenses. The polite tournament of implied comparison that passed for friendship in the circles Alexander had long inhabited. He had smiled. He had participated. He had said the right things. And all the way home in the car, the silence had felt heavier than usual. He loosened his tie as he stepped through the front door. The house was dim, quiet. He crossed toward the study, his default, his retreat, the place where he went when he didn't know what else to do with himself. And then he saw the light from the living room. The fireplace was lit. He stopped. He stepped into the living room. And there was Miriam. Standing by the fireplace. Holding something. He saw it before he fully processed it, a small bottle, no larger than a hand, wrought in gold so detailed and so intricate that it seemed to belong to another era entirely. The patterns on its surface were unlike anything he recognized, not Greek, not African, not Asian. Something older than category. Something that existed at the intersection of all of them. He stood in the doorway for a moment, just looking. "What is that?" he asked. His voice came out quieter than he intended. Miriam turned slowly. Her face was calm. Her eyes, in the firelight, were steady. "This," she said, "is something you have been searching for without knowing it." He almost laughed. The instinct was immediate, the sharp, defensive amusement of a man who does not like to be caught in vulnerability, who reflexively reaches for irony when sincerity feels too close. But something stopped him. Something in her voice. It was not mystical. It was not theatrical. It was simply honest. As if she were stating a fact. "I don't deal in riddles," he said. "I know," she replied. "That's why I'm not speaking in riddles." She moved toward the low table near the fireplace and placed the bottle down with extraordinary care. The firelight caught it again, all those intricate, ancient patterns, all that deep gold. "Where did you get that?" he asked. "It has been in my keeping for a long time," she said. "And I have been waiting to know whose hands it belongs to next." He crossed the room slowly. He stood over it. Looked at it. "What does it do?" he asked. She looked at him steadily. "It changes what cannot be changed." The fire crackled. Outside, a wind moved through the old oak at the edge of the property. He looked up at her. "That's not an answer." "No," she agreed. "It's a beginning. If you're selling something," he said carefully, "I'm not interested. And if this is some kind of—" "It isn't for sale," she said. A pause. "It's for you." He stood with that for a moment. This was not rational. He was a rational man. He dealt in contracts, in numbers, in things that could be measured and verified and built. And yet, he could not walk away. "Why?" he asked. "Why me?" Miriam looked at him. Not with pity. Not with the careful performance of compassion he had learned to read in people's faces over decades of being watched. She looked at him with something far simpler. Recognition. "Because you believe your story is over," she said quietly. "And it isn't." He looked at the bottle for a long time. "Open it," she said, "and everything you believe about yourself will shift." A pause. "Or leave it closed, and nothing will." The fire crackled again. "What's inside it?" he asked. She smiled then, a small, quiet smile. "That's not the right question," she said. He looked up. "Then what is the right question?" She paused. "The right question," she said, "is whether you are ready to stop being defined by what you were told you could not have." He didn't open it that night. He couldn't have explained why. Some part of him understood, instinctively, that whatever this moment was, it wasn't about the bottle. It was about something else entirely. Something he wasn't quite ready to name yet. He thanked her. He told her she should get some rest. He stood by the fireplace alone for a long time after she had gone. And then, slowly, he picked up the golden bottle and carried it to his room. He placed it on the bedside table. And he lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, with a feeling he had not felt in a very long time. Hope. Just a thread of it. Thin and fragile and tentative as the first light before dawn. But real. He did not sleep. In the days that followed, Alexander did not open the bottle. And something remarkable happened. Something changed anyway. Not in any way he could have predicted. Not in any way that matched the story he had told himself about what change required. He began to notice things. Simple things. Small things. The way the light fell across the study floor in the late afternoon, turning everything amber and gold. The way the house smelled in the mornings when Miriam had been cooking, not elaborate things, just good things. Eggs. Coffee. Something baking. The way silence, when it wasn't filled with absence and grief, could feel like rest. He started sleeping again. Not immediately. But gradually. He started eating at the dining table. He started leaving the curtains open. He started taking calls from people he had been avoiding, not because he had resolved anything, but because he was beginning to understand that isolation, however much it felt like self-protection, had become its own kind of damage. And he and Miriam talked. Every morning. Sometimes in the evenings. Not deep conversations, always. Sometimes just pleasant ones. The kind that exist not to solve or explain, but simply to establish the comfortable fact of another person's presence. She talked about her children. Her late husband. A garden she had once grown in a small house in Georgia that she had loved more than any property she'd seen since. He talked about his parents. His early years. Things he had not said aloud to anyone since Eleanor, things that had been sitting in him so long they had started to feel like they were just part of the structure of him, not things that had ever been chosen. He was beginning to understand that he had spent the last several years of his life in a kind of relentless motion, not because movement was required, but because stillness had become frightening. And now, in the stillness, he was beginning to discover that he hadn't disappeared. He was still there. And more than that, he was beginning to be glad about it. He didn't know the boy's name, at first. He only knew that when he opened the front door on that Tuesday morning and found a child standing on his step, he felt something detonate quietly in his chest that he had no name for. Not alarm. Not confusion. Although both of those things were present. Something deeper. Something that moved through him the way music moves through a room, reaching into corners he had long since closed off. The boy looked up at him steadily. There was something in his eyes. A quality that Alexander, standing there in the morning light, couldn't quite place. "Can I help you?" Alexander asked. The boy said nothing. He reached into his jacket pocket and held out an envelope. Alexander took it. He looked at his name written on the front. In Eleanor's handwriting. He stood there for a moment before he opened it. The boy waited. The letter was 3 pages long. He read every word. And the world rearranged itself. Eleanor had written that she owed him more than silence. That in the years since she had left, she had done the things she had been unable to do while she was still inside their shared pain, she had thought clearly. She had taken stock. And she had finally found the courage to tell him something she had been carrying alone for 4 years. Something that had happened before the diagnosis. Before the specialist visits. Before the treatments. Before the years of quiet grief. Something that had happened in the early days of their marriage when they were still young and brave and certain that love was enough to organize the entire future around. She had been pregnant. Once. Very early. Before they had even begun trying in any serious way. A surprise, a startling, breathtaking, terrifying, beautiful surprise. She had told no one. Not even him. She had been waiting for the right moment, for enough certainty, for the fear to subside enough to let the joy in fully. But the pregnancy had not held. She had lost it quietly. Alone. Before he ever knew. And in her grief, in the disorientation of a loss she hadn't been prepared for and hadn't known how to share, she had closed a door. A door she didn't fully realize she'd closed until much later. But before she'd closed it, the boy had been conceived. "I didn't tell you," the letter read. "Because I didn't know how. Because we were both so deep in grief by then that adding another layer felt impossible. And because I was afraid that if I gave you this, and then something went wrong, I wouldn't survive it. But he's real, Alexander. He is 10 years old, and he is healthy, and he is curious, and he has your jaw and your mother's eyes and your habit of going completely still when he's thinking hard about something. And I have asked him to go to you. Not because I don't love him, God, there is nothing in this world I love more. But because I have watched him look for something in every room for years now. And I think what he is looking for is his father. He is yours." He looked at the boy. And the boy looked back. And in that look, that quiet, uncertain, hoping against itself look, Alexander saw something he recognized. He saw himself. Not the billionaire. Not the empire builder. Not the composed, controlled man who smiled through dinners and signed contracts and had somehow become, without ever deciding to, a man most people found impressive but almost no one truly knew. He saw the boy in the cold apartment. The boy whose mother had pressed her hand to his chest and said, "You can be anything." He saw what it looked like to be standing on a threshold. hoping someone would open the door all the way. Alexander Hale, who had built empires, who had never once in his adult life not known what to do, stood in his own doorway. And then he stepped aside. And said simply, "Come in." His name was Samuel. He was 10 years old. He liked astronomy and terrible puns and the kind of old adventure stories that most children his age had never heard of. He was quiet at first, the way children are quiet when they are weighing something, not withdrawn, just careful. Thoughtful. He had Eleanor's grace and something else. Something harder to articulate. A quality of attention. Of noticing things other people missed. Alexander recognized it immediately. He had spent his entire life being told it was ambition. In Samuel, he saw what it actually was. Curiosity. Learning to be a father was not easy. He would be the first to tell you that. There were days when he did not know what to do. Days when he said the wrong thing, or forgot something important, or fell back into work habits that crowded out presence. Days when Samuel was quietly disappointed and Alexander could see it and had to resist every urge to problem-solve his way out of a moment that simply required him to show up and stay. But he showed up. And he stayed. He learned to cook at least 3 things reliably. He learned the names of every constellation that Samuel could identify. He learned that the best conversations happened in a car, for some reason, something about the fact of facing forward together rather than toward each other made honesty easier. He learned that fatherhood was not a transaction. It was a practice. Daily. Imperfect. Ongoing. The most important work he had ever done. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, he stopped asking the question. What is a man without a legacy? Because he had found the answer. Not the answer he expected. Not the answer anyone would have predicted for a man like him. The answer was this. A man without a legacy is a man who hasn't yet understood what legacy actually means. Legacy was not a name carved into a building. Legacy was not a fortune left in a will. Legacy was a boy who knew he was loved. Legacy was a laugh in a house that used to be silent. Legacy was showing someone, one small, watching, brilliant person, that the world was worth being curious about. That was the empire that mattered. Richard found him at the next event. Approached him with a manner that had something new in it, a slight softening. As if he, too, had heard something. As if the story that had filtered back through their shared circles had landed on him in a way he hadn't expected. "Alexander," he said. "I heard about the boy." A pause. "Congratulations." Alexander looked at him. He did not say, "Now you know what it feels like to be wrong about someone." He did not say, "I wonder how funny your jokes feel to you now." He simply said, "Thank you, Richard." And meant it. Because here is what Alexander Hale had learned, the thing that no amount of money, strategy, or ambition had been able to teach him, but that one quiet woman and one steady boy had. The people who mock you from the outside of your pain are almost never as powerful as they appear to be. They are usually people who are afraid of the same thing they are mocking. And the only response to them that carries any real weight is a life well lived. He picked up the golden bottle. Turned it in his hands. Looked at those intricate, ancient patterns. And then he did something that surprised even himself. He smiled. Not the practiced smile. Not the controlled one. Not the one that said I don't care. A real one. Because he understood now. He understood what Miriam had been doing, all along. She hadn't offered him a magic solution. She hadn't given him a miracle in a bottle. She had given him something far more precise and far more difficult. She had given him permission. Permission to stop grieving the story he had expected to live. Permission to look up and see the one that was actually unfolding. Permission to open a door he had been standing in front of for years, afraid to cross the threshold, afraid to want something that might be taken away, afraid to discover that he was capable of more than he had allowed himself to believe. He placed the bottle back down. Gently. Finally. The bottle had never needed to be opened. Because it wasn't about what was inside. It was about what he had been willing to believe could be there. The next morning, he woke early. Went to the kitchen. Made breakfast, his standard 3 reliable things, and called down the hall that it was ready. Footsteps. The sound of a 10-year-old who hasn't quite mastered the concept of moving at a moderate pace. Samuel appeared in the kitchen doorway, still half asleep, backpack on one shoulder by force of habit, looking at the breakfast on the table with the expression of someone who had decided, somewhere between waking and arriving, that this morning might be good. "What's for breakfast?" he asked. "Eggs," Alexander said. "Again? They're good eggs." Samuel considered this. "Fine," he said. And sat down. Outside, the morning came in through the open curtains. The house was full of light. Miriam was gone. No warning. No goodbye. He stood in the doorway of her room for a long moment. And then he nodded slowly. As if some part of him had known. Some part of him had understood, all along, that she was not the kind of presence that overstays. She had come when she was needed. She had stayed as long as she was supposed to. And when her work was done, not the domestic work, but the other work, the deeper and more essential work, she had slipped away as quietly as she had arrived. Like something that had never quite belonged to the ordinary world. He thought about trying to find her. He even started, once, made a call, asked a question, had someone do a preliminary search. And then stopped. Some things, he was learning, do not need to be explained. Some gifts do not need a receipt. Some presences do their work and disappear, and the only right response is gratitude. He closed her door gently. And went back to his son. Years would pass. And people would still speak of Alexander Hale. Still reference the empire. Still cite the deals. Still hold him up as evidence that ambition, applied with enough intelligence and discipline, could move a man from nothing to everything. But the people who knew him, truly knew him, would tell you something different. They would tell you that the greatest thing Alexander Hale ever built, was not a company. It was a home. Not a house. A home. The kind that has footsteps in the hallway and laughter in the kitchen and someone who knows how you like your coffee and someone who falls asleep on the couch and someone who, when they walk through the door, makes the whole place feel like it has exhaled. The kind that turns a structure of stone and glass and money into something alive. Something that breathes. And the golden bottle? It sat on his bedside table for years. Unopened. A reminder. Not of what he had been given. But of what he had chosen to believe was possible. Because here is the truth that Miriam carried into that house, not in her hands, but in everything she was. The most powerful changes in a human life do not come from outside of us. They come from the moment we make a decision. A quiet, fundamental, life-altering decision. To stop being defined by loss. To stop measuring ourselves by the things we were told we could never have. To open our eyes, wide open, and see, clearly and without apology. The life that is actually ours. The story that is actually being written. Alexander Hale learned that late. But he learned it. And maybe, just maybe, that is the most human thing about him. Not that he was great. But that he was willing, eventually, to become present. Before you go, I want to ask you something. And I want you to sit with it. Not answer it immediately. Just let it settle. Have you ever been defined by something you didn't choose? A loss. A limitation. A story someone else told about you, or a story you told about yourself, that felt so permanent you stopped questioning it. Have you ever stood in front of a door you were afraid to open? And what did you do? Tell me in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me what this story stirred in you. Tell me if Alexander's journey reminded you of someone, maybe someone you love, maybe yourself. And tell me this. Do you believe in second chances? Because I do. I believe in them deeply. I believe in the kind that don't arrive on schedule, that don't look the way you expected, that sometimes come wrapped in something ancient and quiet and unexpected, held in the hands of a woman you didn't quite understand until she was gone. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Someone who's carrying a grief they haven't named. Someone who's been laughed at for something they couldn't control. Someone who's standing in front of a door and just needs a voice to say. You don't have to open it today. But please, don't stop believing in what might be on the other side. Subscribe if you haven't already, and not just for the next story. Subscribe because I believe you deserve stories that reach into you and remind you of what you already know. And our next story? Our next story begins with a widow who received a letter from her husband. 10 years after he died. I'll see you there.